All right, welcome back to World War One, which is Chapter 4 of American history. Today we're going to be talking about Lesson 3, America entering World War One. Yesterday we left off talking about how the Zimmerman telegram, the overt action directly against the United States on behalf of Germany towards Mexico, is the action that will dictate the American national government to getting into World War One and asking for a declaration of war. Keep in mind that the Lusitania played a major influence into the U.S. entering World War One, and that influence was American public opinion, but it did not cause America to join the war. So the first thing in talking about America getting into World War One is that we had a 200,000 man standing army. If you recall back to the beginning of the war, we were talking about how Germany had a massive army and that they sent like 1.6 million men into battle for the first wave. And by the end of the battle, or by the end of the war, they had over 13.5 million people that were either currently serving or had previously served and died in their military. So our 200,000 man army isn't going to do much on the large scale of armies in Europe. So we have got to beef it up. We've got to get people to join. And the Selective Service Act is the avenue that the U.S. takes through that. In 1917, the Selective Service Act required all men ages 18 to 35 to register for conscription, which is calling to military duty. Within 3 months, 24 million men had registered. So we had a potential army of 24 million. But logistically speaking, there's no way that America could have fed and armed 24 million men and still had supplies to give to the army as the war waged on. So out of the 24 million men, we drafted 3 million, trained them, sent them to basic, taught them how to be soldiers. And then out of that 3 million, we sent 2 million over to Europe, and only about 1.5 million of the 2 million we sent to Europe saw action. So the question's got to be begged, how do you send a military? How do you send 2 million men to Europe? Well, it's going to take a lot of ships, and our Navy is not equipped to do that at the time. So the mandate goes out to the shipyards that if you worked in a shipping yard, first and foremost, you'd be immune from the draft, which is going to incentivize a lot of people to work. And that's, you're either going to work or you're going to fight in time of war. And so workers being immune from the draft is going to cause a lot of them to kind of latch on to that effort. And then they start building ships, kind of the mandate, go build as many battleships and destroyers and submarines as you can. As an interesting side note, by Independence Day of 1918, so the war's almost over at that point, the United States launches 96 new warships. And so our Navy explodes in terms of the numbers that we had. At the time, we had 16 to 20 modern naval vessels, and so it really beefs up our Navy. Transportation-wise, we're going to use something called the convoy system, which is we're going to take our destroyers and our battleships, and we are going to surround the merchant and transport vessels as they go across the Atlantic. So today, think of, in terms of, if we didn't have a huge Navy, we would take vessels like a Disney cruise ship. If that was available, if that was in 1916, we would take a Disney cruise ship because we're not going to be going on any cruises in a time of war. And we would use that Disney cruise ship for storage. We'd pack the cargo areas of it with food and ammo and anything that we could get in there, and we'd use the crew quarters and the housing quarters for the soldiers as we went across the ocean, commandeering things like that. Obviously, there's nothing of that scale available, but those are the merchant and transport vessels that I'm talking about, unarmed, non-military vehicles or vessels. And so as they go across the Atlantic, the military vessels are going to surround these and protect them from any submarine warfare. Out of the 2 million men that were transported, we only lose 238. And so the convoy system is very, very effective. When we arrive in Europe, Americans bring with us 2 million men, which to many people is not even enough to win the war. But more importantly, since we're not a military power, nobody's afraid of the military might of the United States, we bring freshness. we bring with us this new enthusiasm. Think about how excited you and your friends may get when something happens in a class, and after that class is done in the hallways, you're talking about it, you're high-fiving, and how excited you get, because many of these men that are sent over there are roughly your age, a year, maybe 2 years older than you. And so as they get off the ships, they're excited about war, they're high-fiving each other, and that excitement, that energy is going to rub off on the Allies. It's probably one of our most significant uh, attributes in coming into the war. At home, we got to make sure that everybody is working as hard as they can, because the war effort at home is almost more important than how the fighting is going overseas. And so there's going to be a load of propaganda, which is designed, biased communication to influence people's thoughts and actions. And in this case, they're influencing that the war is a good idea, that the war is just, that we should be doing our jobs to help supply the war. There'd be paintings in buildings, on the side of buildings, giant mosaics painted on the side of buildings. There'd be posters, there'd be sculptures, there'd be people proclaiming in the large cities on top of soapboxes why the war is a good thing. And so propaganda is a huge portion of keeping morale up so that the people back home do the duty that they can to help out in the war. Speaking of doing their duty, African Americans find an avenue for helping during this time and for bettering their own lives. So at this point in time, it's about a decade-long process. We have what we call the Great Migration. African Americans largely lived in the South because after slavery was abandoned and outlawed, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the knowledge or the power to move elsewhere. So they settled down around the former plantations and developed families there. These African Americans are subject to many hardships, racism that's abundant in the South, and the Jim Crow laws, which foster your segregation of whites and blacks and have the voting stipulations with the literacy test and the tax on the poll place. So they have a lot of hardships, and hundreds of thousands of African Americans see an opportunity during World War I to move away from the South and go to the industrial cities in the North and get an industrial job and flee some of these hardships. And so that's what the Great Migration is. On the other side, we have this anti-immigrant hysteria. So anybody that was German or Austro-Hungarian by ancestry, or that was a recent immigrant, brought a lot of anxiety to Americans. That you'd look over and you'd say, hey, I will use my last name for an example. Smock is a German name, and it'd be recognizable as a German name, especially back then. They go, Smock, you're a German, are you not? And I'd say yes. And well, when did your family come over? And well, today I couldn't even tell you. It's been 200 or more years since my family, the Smocks, came over to the United States, and not being able to tell them would only foster more anxiety and more questions about my intentions, about my job. Why are you carrying around a notebook? Are you a spy? And this anxiety is going to keep some Americans from doing their job fully to the best of their ability. Furthermore, if there were people that were being harassed from the German and Austro-Hungarian immigrant side, then they're going to speak out against the war effort. That it's America. This isn't as great as I thought it was. That there's no reason that I should continue to push to be my best here. And so, as a direct response to this anti-immigrant hysteria and the actions that are taking place because of it, the United States passes two laws: the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. Espionage, by definition, is spycraft, is spying and communicating with an enemy. So if I was a German spy and I was spying, then this puts into law that that's illegal, and it's punishable by up to 20 years in prison and $10,000 in fines. And the Sedition Act, a seditious behavior is speech, where I am convincing another person that the war is not just, that the cause is not just, that they should not work towards the war. That sort of speech is seditious. And the Sedition Act says that you can't do that in a time of war, which is very close to an infringement on your First Amendment rights, freedom of speech. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out after the war. But that's also punishable by up to 20 years in prison and $10,000. That's the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Military powers, we go into Europe. Of course, we bring with us the soldiers. Soldiers in this time are known as the American Expeditionary Force because it is like an expedition for most of them to an unexplored new territory, even though some of them were sons, daughters, granddaughters, great-grandsons, and daughters of immigrants. They don't know Europe. They have never been there. They might not have even been told stories about it. And so it's like an expedition to them. Many of them have never even left their local regions, like Southwest Nebraska. Many of them have never left that region of the United States. They're led by General John J. Pershing. And quick reminder, he's the guy that led the 15,000 troops to chase down Pancho Villa in the previous chapter, although unsuccessfully. We also have aircraft, and American aircraft in this time is just a little blip of World War I. Airplanes first used for reconnaissance, to fly over, to map where the enemy is, where their strongholds are, where their stores are. And then they slowly evolved. This aircraft, by the way, is not a massive metal aircraft like you think of it today. It's a pine wood frame covered by canvassing, much like you would paint on. And that allows the air to pass by it and not straight through it, and a very powerful engine that would more pull the aircraft through the air than actually create flight. Somebody had the idea that you could add a lever and drop a single bomb from the aircraft, and so they were able to put a single, maybe double, but not much more than that because of the weight distribution issues. Being a very light aircraft and having a lot of weight in the back would cause issues with the aircraft. And then they also added a machine gun. And there's a timing belt between the engine and the machine gun, so you obviously wouldn't shoot your propeller. And adding the machine gun, we introduce dogfighting, which is the fighting between one ace or one fighter pilot and another. Eddie Rickenbacker is the American fighter pilot for World War I. He has 26 confirmed kills throughout World War I. He faces off against other great pilots from other nations, including the Flying Circus, very well-trained aviators from Germany. And they're led by one Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron. And for years, he was kind of the symbol of fear in the air, of superiority. But that's kind of faded, especially in cartoons here in the United States for the 60s and 70s and 80s. As they made cartoons, they'd often incorporate the Red Baron. Today, he's more known for his delightful frozen pizzas. Just because you were drafted into the war doesn't necessarily mean that you agreed with it. Disagreeing with being drafted and having a justification are two completely different topics. If you just disagree and you don't want to go fight, they'd often tell you, too bad, so sad, get to work, buddy. But a conscientious objector differs from a person that just disagrees. A conscientious objector opposes warfare based upon their moral or religious beliefs. Typically, thou shalt not kill listed in the Bible. And the person for World War I that we're going to talk about is Alvin York. There are numerous conscientious objectors. Alvin York is the example that we're going to use for World War I because he becomes a wartime hero. He says that it's not morally okay to kill another man. And through this, he actually goes to court and has to plead his case where the court asks him, and the typical example is if someone breaks into your home and they're holding your wife, your children hostage, threatening to kill them in any instance, in any cause, is it okay to injure or possibly end that other man's life in the protection or the pursuit of protection of the innocents? And Alvin York agreed that if the cause is just, then it is okay. In that instance, where he is threatening an innocent, it would be okay to end that man's life to protect innocence. And as such, the innocence of France and Great Britain and the United States by extension are being threatened. And he would agree to military service, but he would not kill anyone in any circumstance that was not warranted. And a perfect example of this is as he is over there, an AEF member, American Expeditionary Force member, in no man's land, he's being tracked and pursued by a large number of Germans, him and 6 other AEF members. And they are able, in a firefight, to kill 25 Germans and then demand their surrender, convincing the Germans that they had superior numbers. And then once the Germans were disarmed, the American soldiers reveal themselves, and the fact that there were only 7 of them total, they capture 132 Germans. And this conscientious objector, as an example of being able to fulfill his duty as a soldier, even though he wasn't going to kill people if they didn't deserve it, becomes a wartime hero because he is doing his duty and he is keeping his moral principles. Last slide for today. New to war. During World War I, we see a list of weapons that are added and a list of hazards for those that are taking part in the war. The first of the weapons is the machine gun. Now, going back to your revolutionary time period, the weapon of choice was the black powder rifle. And it was very ineffective because it took time to load. It was semi-inaccurate at any range. And so by the time World War I starts, we no longer use the black powder rifle. As a matter of fact, it is kind of into the annals of history at that time. We use the self-contained cartridge bolt-action rifle. And so there is a magazine that you're attached to the gun, and you can pull the lever back, which would chamber a new round, and then close the chamber and fire and rinse and repeat. And so that's the weapon that starts World War I. But they have this question as to, can you have a gun that if you simply hold the trigger down, that would automatically chamber a new round by itself? And they research this, and they come up with the invention of the machine gun, being able to fire fully auto by depressing the trigger. And the machine gun brings with it a wave of destruction. Never before in human history had anybody been able to kill so many people so effortlessly. And the machine gun is largely contributed to the massive deaths of World War I. We talked about airplanes being able to bomb and strafe and fight in the air, and Zeppelins, which are massive dirigibles, balloons like the Hindenburg, except hopefully not as flammable. The Zeppelins would park themselves over in battled areas with machine guns that were able to point down into the trenches and fire down into those trenches. And they were massive weapons of destruction, and nobody could really counter them until they came up with the anti-aircraft gun, which fires a round up into the air, more like a grenade. And the grenade has a timer, and at the end of that timer, it explodes with sharp metal shards. And those shards would tear the canvassing of those Zeppelins and airplanes to pieces. And so you can see in this example now, you see new inventions inspiring secondary new inventions and tertiary new inventions. That's what warfare does, is that you have to constantly try to stay ahead of the enemy or the new technology to try to find an upper hand. The next example is the tank. This is the first debut of something like the tank. It was actually a British invention, and it was a self-contained vehicle, an armored vehicle with a gun that would allow one driver, maybe a driver and passenger initially, to plow through the barbed wire on enemy lines and not get stuck in the trench and be able to go over top of the trench without getting stuck. And its effectiveness is noticed, although at first not terribly effective. But the tank begins to grow, and by the end of the war, you have tanks that are 20 feet long and 8 feet, 10 feet wide, and that are manned by 5, 6, 7 people. So the tank is unveiled onto the battlefield, and immediately they see how valuable it is. And then you have your poison gases, your chemical warfare. Chlorine gas, colorless and odorless. It You don't even notice it's there until you inhale. And once you inhale the chemical, the ammonia and chlorine that's in there will chemically burn your esophagus, your nose hairs, and your lungs tissue. If you have long-term exposure to chlorine, the chemical burning will actually cause you to suffocate because your lungs can no longer transfer carbon dioxide and oxygen. And so the CO2 would build up in your blood and you would die. The mustard gas is another chemical warfare. Mustard gas is a little different in the fact that it attacks the nervous system. It actually gets absorbed in through the skin and then causes searing pain. Um, Often described as like a hot knife searing pain. And your body tries to expunge this chemical. And as it tries to expunge, it creates these large mustard colored blisters. And those blisters would often burst open and be a pussy, disgusting sore where that chemical once was. And the big problem is if you're exposed to a large amount of this, you're going to lose a lot of skin, and the skin keeps in water, and people would die long suffering deaths. After World War I, we come to an agreement that chemical warfare like this is not allowed in any form of warfare any longer. We also have some hazards, new things that soldiers experienced in warfare during World War I that they had never experienced before. Not necessarily weapons, but other things to take away and that affected the lives of those fighting. The first is shell shock. Initially, it was thought that the mortar fire and the continuing fire had some reverberation and concussive issues. And the shell shock was just the rattling of the brain and that it would settle down. Today, we understand that it's post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a psychological issue. Then you have vermin and lice that would get into the barracks and the food supplies. You have polluted water because the water had to come from your home country, and it could be dirty. It could be infected with bacteria, and which would cause dysentery or massive diarrhea issues. And then you have trench foot, which is athlete's foot on steroids, causing the bacteria, the fungus to eat away at the flesh of the foot, even so much more than what's on your screen that it would eat down to the bone, and soldiers would have to have amputations done. The trench mouth is the exact same thing, except it's in your mouth, obviously not in your feet, because dental care was not a big thing of the era. And with that, we come to the end of another lesson. I will come back with lesson 4 here shortly.